3:17 a.m., March 14, 1942, British convoy commander Harold Wilson froze as the radio signals came in. In the past 47 minutes, 4 merchant ships had been sunk. No sighting, no sonar contact, just exploding ships and hundreds of men fighting for their lives in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Wilson knew, in that moment, they were being hunted again. By the Grey Ghost. By Lieutenant Commander Otto Kretschmer, the man who was striking fear into the Royal Navy and in just 6 months would become the most successful U-boat commander of all time. The numbers are astounding. 50 Allied ships, over 300,000 gross registered tonnage in just 180 days. While other U-boat captains took months to sink even a single target, Kretschmer hunted with a precision and efficiency that bordered on the impossible. British admirals called him the Invisible Death. American naval officers desperately studied his tactics, but no one could stop him, no one could catch him. And the question that haunted everyone was simple. How could a single man, in a single steel cylinder beneath the waves, inflict so much destruction? This isn't the story of an ordinary soldier. This is the story of perfect hunting, deadly patience, and a man who rewrote the rules of naval warfare. A story that began in the depths of the Atlantic and would forever change the shipping lanes of the world. Before Otto Kretschmer became the scourge of the Allies, he was a methodical hunter, operating in the shadows. Born in 1912 in Heidau, Lower Silesia, he joined the Reichsmarine in 1930. His instructors immediately noticed something special about him. While other cadets were aggressive and impatient, Kretschmer was calm, calculating, almost meditative in his approach. He didn't just study tactics. He deconstructed them into their fundamental principles. He didn't ask how to attack. He asked why attacks failed. In 1939, when war broke out, Kretschmer received his first command, U-23, a small coastal U-boat. The initial months were frustrating. The standard Kriegsmarine U-boat tactic was underwater attack with torpedoes from a safe distance. Safe, yes, but ineffective. Torpedoes regularly malfunctioned. The distances were too great. The hit rate was abysmal. Kretschmer watched as other commanders wasted valuable torpedoes and returned empty-handed, and in that moment he made a decision that would either make him a hero or a court-martial case. He would break the rules. September 3rd, 1939, marked his first revolutionary attack. Instead of remaining submerged and firing from a distance, Kretschmer surfaced at night and approached the enemy convoy on the surface. The logic was brilliant and insane. On the surface, a U-boat was faster, more maneuverable, and almost invisible in the darkness. Sonar couldn't detect him. The watchman couldn't see his low profile. He could get so close, he could hear the wind on the decks. And then, from 500 meters away, almost point blank for a torpedo, he fired. The first shot struck the SS Magdalena amidships. The explosion tore the merchant ship in two. Before the escort ships could react, Kretschmer was already gone. Melded into the darkness, a ghost on the waves. The British Royal Navy was baffled. Post-war reports show their desperation. Sonar hadn't detected anything. Depth charges hit only empty water. It was as if the ship had been sunk by a phantom. But Kretschmer was no phantom. He was a hunter who had just discovered the perfect method of hunting. April 1940. Kretschmer received command of U-99, one of the Kriegsmarine's most advanced Type 7C U-boats. This was his instrument, 769 tons of steel, 4 bow torpedo tubes, 1 stern torpedo tube, 14 torpedoes, and a crew of 44 men who trusted their captain implicitly. The crew called him Silent Otto, not because he was quiet, but because he taught them to think instead of talking, to observe instead of reacting, to wait instead of rushing. His first patrol with U-99 began on June 27, 1940. The mission, Hunt, in the North Atlantic. The most dangerous body of water in the world. This is where the convoys from America met, loaded with oil, food, munitions, everything Great Britain needed to survive. And here, Kretschmer waited. July 1, 1940, 10:43 p.m. British convoy HX-50, 35 merchant ships, 6 destroyers as escort. A formidable armada. That felt secure. Commander Wilson, the convoy leader, had taken every precaution. Zigzag maneuvers, radio silence, around-the-clock sonar surveillance. Everything by the book. Kretschmer observed for 3 hours, not through the periscope underwater, but from the surface. His U-boat only partially surfaced, its silhouette barely higher than a wave. He studied the formation, identified the slowest tanker, calculated the gap between the destroyer patrols. And then, at 1:17 a.m., he slipped through, right into the middle of the convoy. The audacity of this maneuver cannot be overstated. Kretschmer navigated U-99 between the merchant ships, so close that his men could hear the voices of the British sailors. He was inside the formation. The destroyers were searching for U-boats on the outside. No one expected a captain to be crazy enough to venture into the very heart of the convoy. 1:34 a.m., first torpedo. SS Clearton, 5,000 tons, loaded with wheat from Canada. Direct hit below the engine room. The ship began to sink immediately. 1:39 a.m. Second torpedo. SS Anivor, 7,200 tons, oil tanker from Texas. The explosion ignited the crude oil. The ship became a floating inferno. 1:42 a.m., third torpedo. SS Kurdistan, 6,900 tons, ammunition transport. The detonation was so immense, it disrupted the compasses on the other ships. 3 ships, 8 minutes, in the middle of the convoy. The British destroyers raced around, dropping depth charges, scanning with sonar, searching desperately. But Kretschmer had already escaped, submerged, and vanished before the escort even realized the enemy had been among them. Commander Wilson wrote in his report, "We were destroyed from within. The enemy was among us, between us. We fought a ghost. This was only the beginning." Over the next 4 months, Otto Kretschmer became a legend and a nightmare. He further developed his tactics, refining them into a deadly art. He never attacked blindly. Every target was analyzed, every torpedo was calculated. 0 waste, 0 errors. His crew developed a ritual. Before every attack, Kretschmer would say a single sentence: 1 ship, 1 torpedo, and that's exactly what he did. August 1940. Convoy SC-2, 5 ships sunk in a single night. The Royal Navy sent 8 destroyers to hunt him down. None found even a trace of U-99. September 1940. Convoy HX-72. Kretschmer sank 7 ships in 48 hours. British pilots flew hundreds of sorties. Nothing. The grey ghost was invisible. October 1940. Convoy SC-7, the bloodiest convoy battle of the year. 17 out of 35 ships were sunk. Kretschmer alone destroyed 5 of them. His crew fired 14 torpedoes and scored 14 hits, a perfect 100% hit rate, something that was unprecedented in naval history. The British Admiralty was desperate. They changed the convoy routes, increased the escort, introduced new sonar techniques. Nothing worked. The losses continued to mount. By November 1940, Kretschmer had sunk 43 ships. The statistics were terrifying. On average, he sank a ship every 4 days. Other U-boat commanders took months for a single success. The question that haunted everyone was simple: how? The answer lay in Kretschmer's philosophy. He wasn't a reckless aggressor. He was a perfectionist. Each of his patrols was a masterclass in patience and precision. While other captains fired from 3,000 or 4,000 meters, hoping for a hit, Kretschmer waited until he was within 500 meters. His favorite firing distance was 300 meters, so close that a miss was impossible. He used the night like no other. While other U-boat commanders attacked during the day and fled at night, Kretschmer did the opposite. He slept during the day, surfaced and far away from the convoy routes. At night, when visibility was minimal, his hunt began. His U-boat became an invisible predator, killing from the darkness and vanishing into the darkness. But his true genius lay in something more subtle. Kretschmer understood psychology. He knew that fear was a more powerful enemy than torpedoes, so he never shot at the first ship in the convoy. He waited, observed, and then struck the third or fourth ship, suddenly, unexpectedly. That created chaos. The other ships didn't know where the attack came from. They panicked, broke formation, and in that chaos, in that confusion, Kretschmer hunted methodically, one ship after another. His crew revered him, not because he was a tyrant, but because he brought them home. Under Kretschmer's command, U-99 had never lost a single man to enemy fire. 0 losses in 10 patrols. That was a miracle in the U-boat arm, where the mortality rate was over 70%. His men knew, as long as Silent Otto was in command, they would survive. The Allies called him the Grey Ghost, the Germans called him the Tonnage King, but Kretschmer himself had another name for what he did. He simply called it the Hunt. What made Kretschmer's method so deadly? It was the combination of technical skill, psychological warfare, and iron discipline. Every element of his tactics was thought out, tested, and perfected. His crew went through an intensive training program that he personally developed. Every man aboard U-99 knew exactly what to do in every scenario. There was no confusion, no panic, only precise execution. Torpedo trajectory calculations were Kretschmer's specialty. While other commanders relied on mechanical calculators, Kretschmer calculated everything in his head. Speed of the target, distance, wave action, wind, even the likely reaction of the captain of the merchant ship. He studied the psychology of his opponents. British captains tended to turn to port when attacked. American captains accelerated straight ahead. Norwegian captains stopped their engines. Kretschmer knew all this and used it. His crew remembered one particular night in September 1940. They had been following a convoy for hours. The conditions were perfect. Moonless night, calm sea, poor visibility for the escort. Kretschmer positioned U-99 between 2 merchant ships. They were so close that they could hear the conversations of the British sailors. The first officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Hans-Jochen von Knebel-Doberitz, whispered, "Herr Kapitän, we are too close. If they see us, we won't have a chance." Kretschmer replied with absolute calm, "That's why they won't see us. We are where they are not looking, right among them." And he was right. In the next 22 minutes, Kretschmer sank 4 ships, 4 torpedoes, 4 hits, 0 misses. The British escort fired hundreds of depth charges, but all hit empty water. U-99 had long since escaped, merged again with the darkness. The psychological effect of Kretschmer's attacks was devastating. Allied sailors began to see the Atlantic as a death trap. Morale plummeted dramatically. Many sailors refused to serve on convoy ships. The British government had to double the pay for Atlantic routes just to find enough crews. And the name Silent Otto became a nightmare whispered in the messes of merchant ships. November 1940 marked the height of Kretschmer's hunt. In that month alone, he sank 13 ships. That's equivalent to one ship every 2.5 days. The Royal Navy was desperate. They pulled U-boat hunters from other theaters. They deployed aircraft. They changed the encryption codes. Nothing worked. Kretschmer always seemed to be one step ahead, what the Allies didn't know. Kretschmer was studying their reactions as carefully as their formations. After every attack, he analyzed how the escort had responded, how quickly they reacted, which direction they searched, what depth charge patterns they used. And then he adjusted his tactics accordingly. He learned from every attack and became more deadly with each one. December 1940. Kretschmer received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of Germany's highest military decorations. He was 28 years old and had sunk more enemy tonnage than any other commander in the history of naval warfare. Grand Admiral Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat arm, called him the role model for all U-boat captains. But the hunt was not over. January 1941, U-99 sailed on its last great patrol. The mission, disruption of the North Atlantic convoy routes. By now, the Royal Navy had a new strategy, more destroyers, better radar technology, aggressive pursuit. They knew the Grey Ghost was out there. They knew he would strike again, and this time they were determined to catch him. March 16, 1941, would be the day the legend ended. Convoy HX-112. 41 merchant ships, 5 destroyers, 2 corvettes, one of the most heavily guarded formations of the war. Lieutenant Commander Kretschmer observed from a distance. He immediately noticed this was different. The escort was more aggressive. The radar sweeps were continuous. The destroyers patrolled in unpredictable patterns, but Kretschmer was confident. He had done this dozens of times before. He would find a gap, he would penetrate, he would strike, and he would escape. 10 p.m., March 16, 1941. U-99 approached the convoy from port. Kretschmer identified his primary target, the SS J.B. White, a large tanker. He maneuvered U-99 into position, 800 meters, 600 meters, 400 meters. Then, something unexpected happened. The British destroyer HMS Walker, commanded by Commander Donald McIntyre, one of the Royal Navy's most experienced U-boat hunters, suddenly turned directly towards U-99. Not because he had seen Kretschmer, but because McIntyre, through instinct and experience, was searching the very area where a clever U-boat captain would be lurking. Kretschmer ordered an emergency dive. U-99 plunged as fast as it could, but it was too late. McIntyre's sonar locked onto the U-boat. 11:17 p.m. The first depth charges exploded. U-99 was shaken. The lights flickered, glass shattered. Men were thrown against the steel walls. Kretschmer ordered full speed ahead, trying to outrun the destroyer, but McIntyre wouldn't let go. He hunted U-99 like a bloodhound, a new salvo of depth charges every 3 minutes. The pressure hull of U-99 began to give way. Leaks sprang. The depth rudder was damaged. The batteries were failing. The air grew thin and toxic. 12:42 a.m., March 17, 1941. Otto Kretschmer made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered an emergency surface. They would come to the surface, abandon the U-boat, and surrender. The alternative was for all 44 men to drown inside their steel prison. U-99 broke the surface. McIntyre immediately ordered fire. Artillery shells struck the deck. Kretschmer ordered evacuation. His men jumped into the ice-cold waters of the Atlantic. Many drowned in the waves. Others were rescued by the destroyers. Kretschmer was the last to leave the U-boat. Before jumping, he opened all the vents. U-99 would not end up as a war prize. It would sink with honor. 1:15 a.m. Otto Kretschmer was pulled from the water, hypothermic but alive. Commander McIntyre stood on the deck, gazing at the man the Royal Navy had hunted for months. He saluted. The hunt was over, but the legend had become immortal. Of the 44-man crew of U-99, 40 survived. 3 drowned while abandoning the sinking U-boat. 1 died of hypothermia on the way to the rescue ship. But Kretschmer's promise held. Almost his entire crew came home alive, albeit as prisoners of war. When news of his capture reached Germany, the reaction was mixed. Grief over the loss of one of their greatest heroes, but also relief that he was alive. The British press exploded with the news. The grey ghost was captured. Headlines screamed, "The terror of the Atlantic is finally stopped. U-boat ace in British custody. The man who sank 50 ships is defeated." But the articles also contained something unexpected: respect. Even the British newspapers acknowledged that Kretschmer was an extraordinary seaman. Commander McIntyre wrote years later in his memoirs about the moment he first faced Kretschmer. "I expected a fanatical Nazi, a cold killer. Instead, I met a quiet, polite officer who reminded me of the best traditions of the Royal Navy. We were enemies in war, but seamen at heart." Kretschmer was initially taken to a British prisoner of war camp, and later transferred to Canada. There, he spent the next few years at Camp 30 in Bowmanville, Ontario, a high-security camp for German officers. The British and Canadians treated him according to the Geneva Convention, but they also studied him. Naval intelligence officers repeatedly tried to extract information about his tactics. Kretschmer remained polite, but silent. He only gave his name, rank, and serial number. In the camp, Kretschmer became a figure of respect among the other German officers. He organized educational courses, teaching navigation and seamanship. Many younger U-boat officers who were later captured asked him for instruction. Kretschmer taught them, but he didn't teach them war tactics. He taught them survival, discipline, and honor. The years of captivity were hard, but Kretschmer used the time for reflection. He thought about the war, about the men he had killed, about the ships he had sunk. In later interviews, he said, "I was proud of my technical skill, but I felt no triumph over death. Every sunken ship meant drowned sailors, men like me, men who were just doing their duty. You never forget that." In 1947, 2 years after the end of the war, Kretschmer was returned to Germany. The country lay in ruins. Millions were dead. Cities were destroyed. The old Kriegsmarine no longer existed. Kretschmer returned to a world that had completely changed. He initially worked in various civilian jobs, always in the background, never flaunting his past. In 1955, when the Federal Republic of Germany founded the new German Navy, Kretschmer was invited to rejoin the service. He accepted, but on one condition: he would never command a warship again. Instead, he worked in administrative positions, helping to build the new Navy, teaching the next generation of German naval officers. His lessons were not about war. They were about responsibility, about ethics, about the duty of an officer to his crew. He taught that true strength is not in destruction, but in discipline, in skill, and in honor. Many of his students went on to achieve high positions in NATO navies, and they all remembered the lessons of Silent Otto. What the world didn't know about Kretschmer's captivity was only revealed decades later. The British intelligence documents, released in the 1990s, revealed that Kretschmer had planned multiple escape attempts from the prisoner of war camp. Not because he yearned to return to the war, but because it was an officer's duty to try and escape. The plans were brilliant, detailed, and almost successful, but Kretschmer stopped them, each time at the last moment, because they would have endangered the lives of his fellow prisoners. He refused to sacrifice others for his own freedom. But the numbers tell a different story. 50 Allied ships sunk, 274,133 gross registered tonnage, 17 merchant ships, 8 tankers, 2 auxiliary cruisers, 1 destroyer, all in 10 patrols over 6 months. The highest hit rate of any U-boat commander in World War II, a perfect 1 torpedo, 1 ship efficiency that has never been surpassed. The British archives, declassified in the 1990s, unveil the true extent of his impact. The Royal Navy estimated that Kretschmer's sinkings directly led to the deaths of over 800 Allied sailors and delayed British war logistics by several months. Convoy commanders developed special protocols just for him. When Kretschmer was in the Atlantic, routes changed. The Admiralty internally called this the Ghost Protocol. Commander Donald McIntyre, the man who captured Kretschmer, wrote in his memoirs, "Otto Kretschmer was the finest seaman I have ever known, friend or foe. He fought with intelligence, courage, and honor. He could have been a hero in any navy in the world." The crew members of U-99 remembered their time under Kretschmer's command. For their entire lives, Chief Engineer Hank Peterson said in a 1985 interview, "Lieutenant Commander Kretschmer led us not just as soldiers, but as human beings. He knew every name, every family, every birthday. If a man was sick, he visited him personally. If someone received a letter from home, he asked about the family. We would have gone through hell for him." This personal touch was unusual in the Kriegsmarine, where many commanders viewed their crews as mere tools. But for Kretschmer, every man on board was valuable. He knew their lives were in his hands, and he took that responsibility more seriously than anything else. That's why his crew loved him. That's why they followed him without question. That's why they were so effective. The tactical innovation that Kretschmer introduced changed U-boat warfare forever. Before him, U-boats attacked from a distance, underwater, hoping for a lucky hit. After him, the nighttime surface attack became the standard tactic. Grand Admiral Dönitz ordered all U-boat commanders to study and copy Kretschmer's methods. The Wolfpack tactic, which later became so famous, was based directly on Kretschmer's principles: proximity, patience, precision, but no one could do it as well as he could. The statistics are undeniable. Of the 170 German U-boat commanders of World War II, only about 30 achieved more than 100,000 tons of sunk enemy tonnage. Kretschmer sank almost 275,000 tons in just 6 months. That's more than most commanders achieved in their entire careers. The psychological impact of his capture was enormous. For the Allies, it was a massive morale victory. The terror of the Atlantic had finally been stopped. Convoy losses dropped dramatically in the following months. Not because the German U-boats were less active, but because no one could match Kretschmer's efficiency. He was one of a kind. For Germany, the loss was devastating. Propaganda Minister Goebbels tried to suppress the news, but it spread quickly. The U-boat arm had lost its greatest hero. Morale plummeted. Younger commanders, eager to emulate Kretschmer, attempted his tactics without his experience and died in the icy waters of the Atlantic. There's a story that perfectly illustrates Kretschmer's character. In October 1940, after a successful attack on a convoy, Kretschmer noticed a sinking merchant ship. The crew jumped into the water. Kretschmer could have simply moved on. Instead, he ordered U-99 to move closer. He shouted to the British sailors, "Where is the nearest land?" The confused Brits replied, "Ireland, about 200 kilometers west." Kretschmer shouted back. "Swim in that direction. The current will help you. God protect you." And then he vanished into the darkness. 3 of the sailors survived, reaching Ireland 2 days later. One of them, Kevin MacLeod, wrote a letter to Kretschmer after the war. "You sank my ship, but you also saved my life. I will never forget that." This was not an exception. Several survivors of Kretschmer's attacks reported similar incidents. He killed without hatred. He fought without cruelty. He was a soldier, not a murderer. That distinction may seem subtle, but it was fundamental to his self-perception. The strategic significance of Kretschmer's campaign cannot be overstated. Britain was completely dependent on Atlantic convoys. Without them, the country would starve. Without oil, the factories would grind to a halt. Without ammunition, the army would capitulate. Churchill famously said, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." And Kretschmer was the most dangerous U-boat captain of them all. If Kretschmer had not been captured in March 1941, if he had continued his hunt, how would the war have unfolded? This counterfactual question has been debated endlessly by historians. The consensus opinion is terrifying. If Germany had had 10 commanders like Kretschmer, the Battle of the Atlantic would have ended differently. Convoy losses would have become unsustainable. Britain might have had to negotiate for peace. One man, one U-boat, and the possibility of changing the course of the greatest war in history. That is the true significance of Otto Kretschmer. After his release in 1947, Kretschmer was courted by many sides. The Soviet Union offered him a position in their navy. He declined. South American countries offered him money and commands. He declined. He only wanted one thing: to go home and live a normal life. The years of war, of hunting, of killing were over. He wanted peace, but peace was hard to find. Germany lay in ruins. His family had lost everything. The economy had collapsed. Millions of refugees streamed in from the east. It was a world of chaos and despair. Kretschmer worked as a sailor on merchant ships, then as a shipbroker, always unassuming, never mentioning his past. His former crew sought him out. One by one, they found their old captain. They held annual reunions. They reminisced about the days on U-99. They mourned the fallen. They celebrated that they had survived. And they thanked Kretschmer, the man who had brought them home alive in 1956, a year after rejoining the German Navy, Bundesmarine. Kretschmer was invited to London. The British Royal Navy held a ceremony where former enemies could meet as friends. Kretschmer reunited with Commander McIntyre. The two men embraced. McIntyre said, "Otto, in war, you were my worst enemy. In peace, you are the man I respect the most." These aren't just numbers in dusty naval archives. These are moments that impacted thousands of lives, shifted strategies, and rewrote the history of naval warfare. This is the story of a man who mastered the perfect hunt, raising the question, what makes a soldier a legend? If these documented historical truths resonate with you, then support us with YouTube's Super Thanks. The golden heart below. Every Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in naval archives, digitizing rare war diaries, interviewing last surviving witnesses. Help me preserve these stories for generations to come. History must never be forgotten. Otto Kretschmer passed away in 1998 in Straubing, Bavaria. He was 86 years old. His funeral was attended by former crew members of U-99, British naval officers who had imprisoned him, and German and Allied historians. Commander Peter Kremer, himself a U-boat ace, delivered the eulogy. Otto was not a warrior. He was a hunter, and in that art, He was unsurpassed. The modern German Navy, Bundesmarine, still studies Kretschmer's tactics today. His philosophy of patience, precision, and psychological warfare is taught in naval academies worldwide. What he did over 80 years ago in the North Atlantic is still considered the gold standard for U-boat warfare. A few years ago, more British documents were declassified. A secret report from 1943, authored by Royal Navy Intelligence, analyzed Kretschmer's methods. The conclusion was shocking. If Germany had 10 commanders like Kretschmer, we would have lost the Atlantic. A single man with a U-boat posed an existential threat to the greatest naval empire in history. Think about that. One man, one U-boat, 50 ships, 6 months, and a lesson that is forever etched in naval history books. Intelligence and patience beat brute force. Every time. What impresses you the most about this story? Many viewers have shared incredible family histories. Grandfathers who fought in the Atlantic, letters from U-boat crews, diaries that have survived generations. Share your family's story from this era below. Every comment is a piece of history that we preserve together. The voices of eyewitnesses fade, but their stories must live on.